لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد مفتاح باب رحمة الله عدد ما في علم الله صلاة وسلاما دائمين بدوام ملك الله
Oh, here it is.
وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I greet you all with the greetings of peace. My name is Baraka Blue, and you are tuned into a Rumi Center's community gathering. This occasion which we gather to celebrate our community and to celebrate our spiritual path and to reflect on various topics together. And we try to do this monthly, and this month we have a very special guest, Dr. Abdallah Rothman, who many of you know has been a previous guest and also someone who we've done retreats with and programs with in the past. He's also someone who's going to be a guest teacher on our upcoming course on Sufi psychology. And he's a great person to speak about that topic because he's one of the leaders in the field of Islamic psychology, really bridging the gap between this traditional spiritual psychology of our tradition with that of modern Western psychology. So before getting into that, I wanted to begin, as we like to do, with a poem from our beloved Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. And this poem, some of you will know, it's called The Ruby. And I felt it was apt to read because in this poem, Maulana Rumi, who was one of the greatest spiritual psychologists to ever live, and by that, I mean he had profound understanding and insight into the human soul and into human consciousness, into what veils us from our true nature and our true potential, and into that which will allow us to remove the veils that veil us from that true potential to attain our highest nature. And so this poem gets to the heart of that matter. And of course, all of his poems, he wasn't just an artist, right, writing for art's sake, but he was a spiritual master who used poetry as a means to draw people to their, as he called it, the root of themselves. So this is the poem. It's called The Ruby. A stone which has become a ruby is filled with the qualities of the sun. No stoniness remains in it. If it loves the sun, it is loving itself. If it loves itself, it is loving the sun. There is no difference between these two loves. Before the stone becomes the ruby, it is its own enemy. Not one, but two exist. The stone is dark and blind to daylight. If it loves itself, it is unfaithful, for it intensely resists the sun. If it says I, it is all darkness. A pharaoh claims divinity and is brought down. Halaj says the same word and is saved. One eye is cursed, another eye is blessed. One eye is a stone, another a crystal. One an enemy of the light, the other a reflector of it. In its inmost consciousness and not through any doctrine, it is one with the light. Work on your stony qualities and become resplendent like the ruby. Practice zuhud, self-transformation or self-denial or self-discipline, and accept the difficulty of the path, and always see infinite life in letting the self die, the ego self. Your stoniness will decrease, your ruby nature will grow. The signs of ego existence will leave your body, and ecstasy will take you over. So that's just a portion of this beautiful, beautiful poem from Book 5 of the Masnavi. For those interested, it's Masnavi Book 5, line 2020. And so this sets up, I think, a really beautiful starting point for us to explore the heart, Sufi psychology, the starting point being that each one of us has a ruby nature, which is our true nature. But we also have a stony nature, which is our lower nature. And if you think about the difference between a ruby and a stone, what is the difference? What is the difference between a ruby and a stone? A ruby is transparent and reflective of the light, and a stone blocks the light. So he says very beautifully, if it loves itself, it is loving the sun. If it loves the sun, it is loving itself. Because what is it loving? It's loving light, nur. And so again, our true nature is light and is reflectivity to the divine light. However, until we attain that self, it is obscured by the stone, right? If you ever see these beautiful, beautiful stones that on the outside, they appear just like a stone that you would kick and wouldn't think anything of, but then they've been cracked open and inside these beautiful gems or these beautiful crystals. Each one of us is like that. We have a stony exterior, but we have a ruby interior, our true nature. And so this is really what the spiritual psychology of our tradition is getting at, is that the whole path is attaining to that true self. And what he calls is that one eye is blessed, another eye is cursed. If we speak from that selflessness, which is reflectivity to the light of the divine, then it is blessed. But if we speak from that which blocks that, the ego self, I, me, self-interest without self-discipline, now all of a sudden, we are speaking from a place that is cut off from wholeness, cut off from light, cut off from oneness. And so he mentions the Fir'aun who says, Ana Rabbukum al-A'la, I am your Lord Most High. This is the archetype of that ego self. It wants to be worshipped. It wants to be served. It wants to be put forward. It wants to be first. It wants whatever it can get at the expense of anyone else. But then he mentions Mansur al-Hallaj, one of the great early Sufis, who was so selfless that he overflowed with the light of God. So he's saying that one of them was claiming to be the divine, but it was from his ego. One of them was so egoless that it was just the light of God reflecting through his very being. And because of that, people were confused when he said certain statements. And that's a longer conversation that we'll leave for another day. But I think that's a beautiful place to begin. And with that, I wanted to invite our beloved guest, Dr. Abdallah. Maybe you could begin, Dr. Abdullah, by just using that as a starting point. If I were to ask, what is the difference in the starting point of the human being in the spiritual psychology of Islam or Sufism versus the starting point of the human being in modern Western psychology?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good to be with you all. Jazakallah khair. Sidi Baraka Blue for inviting me. This is our favorite topic to talk about, and there's so much to talk about it. And I think this poem is a beautiful entry point, like you said. And it's like, when we hear the words of Rumi, it for most of us, because we're here at Rumi Center, we love the love and the light, right? And we're understanding this reflection of light and coming back to this spiritual sense of our identity and human identity. But I think how we get caught up in this word psychology. You know, now when people say the word psychology, we're referencing how that term is used in the modern world. And so many of us took classes on psychology, and most universities teach psychology. And always on the psychology books, there's this severed head, right? And so here we are talking about like spiritual psychology and the light and the ruby and the heart. And yet when we hear psychology, it's this severed head. And that severed head usually has like, we can see inside of it, we see the brain, right? And there's no body, and we're talking about the brain. And so suddenly psychology becomes the brain, and like mental, the definition of psychology in the West is the study of mental processes and behavior. And so that really puts a focus on, well, what is the assumption here then? What is the assumption that what the human being is? And so the starting point, like you said, or like you're asking, is it has everything to do with the paradigm with which we see and make sense of the human being. And then how we even understand this word psychology is going to be influenced by what we mean by what this word means. So psyche can be understood as it's the internal dimension of the human being, right? So the study of the internal dimension of human being, the psyche. But traditionally, in traditional psychology, the psyche is the soul. And when I say traditional, is because most traditional societies and belief systems just believed in the soul, believed in the unseen aspect of the world, and therefore the unseen dimension of the human being. And that being the soul that is connected to a transcendent reality. But then if we go back to this word psychology in the textbook, and we see this floating head with no body, it's very clear how our starting point from a secular Western standpoint is a material reality of the human being, right? And so the materiality of the human being is that stoniness that Rumi is speaking of, the stony nature. And from a Islamic perspective, a Sufi perspective, there's nothing inherently wrong with the stony nature. That actually is beautiful in and of itself. The nafs, the sense of ourselves as separate, is beautiful, but it is there is a higher potential that can be it can be polished. The stone can be polished and reveal its ruby nature. But the polishing requires not only work from a behavioral standpoint of like, let me change my behavior, change my thoughts, but there's actually a purification of uncovering our true nature. And again, this metaphor of the ruby, what makes it beautiful is the reflectivity. And the only way that we can understand the reflectivity of the ruby is that it's reflecting light that is from the beyond. So it's not light that we're reflecting internal to ourselves, but that there's something out there transcendent. And so that then paints this whole reality or paradigm of there being a transcendent reality. And so the starting point of most spiritual psychologies, and very much so Sufi psychology, is honoring and really being grounded in the notion that the human being is a spiritual entity, that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. We're not human beings having a spiritual experience, like the French philosopher said. And when we look at modern psychology, it's really just we're human beings having a human experience. And that human experience is defined by, the definition of psychology is the study of mental processes and behavior. And that the reason why we're so stuck on mental processes and behavior, it does come from an ideology or a set of belief. We tend to, everybody wants to say psychology is a science, which is why the book has the brain on it, because if we study the brain, then yeah, we can call it a science because we're studying a tangible sort of biological aspect, right? But I always think that like there should just be a separate discipline that's cognitive neuroscience that studies how the biology of the brain impacts our thoughts, right? That's all good, but that doesn't necessarily define who we are, right? And so that whole notion of thoughts defining who we are does come from a philosophy. So it's not just science, it's Cartesian dualism, essentially. I think, therefore I am. And that is really presupposed on this notion of materialism, and the materiality of trying to understand all existence based on what we can see and measure, based on the physical dimension. And so if you don't, if we're blocking ourselves out, not only from God and the light, but even just sort of like, well, I'm not sure if there's anything out there because I can't see it and measure it, so I'm gonna just cut myself off from it. And many people may be doing that not from a place of like atheism necessarily, but just the fact that like, well, if I can't see and measure it, I'm not comfortable with it, I'm not going to deal with it. To be honest, there's a lot of religious people who take that stance. A lot of Muslims actually take that stance, but it's influenced by this other way of thinking, which is too focused on thinking, and so what this all, to kind of get back to the question of the starting point, if we look at that image on the psychology book cover and it's the brain, people think that their thoughts are the center of who they are. And so when we think of psychology, we automatically go to here. But if the inner reality of the human being, the soul, from a Sufi standpoint, which is all coming from Islam, from what the Quran itself teaches us, is that the heart is the center of the human being. And the heart is this metaphysical reality of the human being that has a physical location, but also has a metaphysical, it's in the spiritual realm and it's in the physical realm. And what it does is it mediates between the stony potentiality of the human being and the ruby potentiality of the human being. And so we're trying to negotiate our humanness by being, occupying our physical dimension here in this world, but not forgetting or being disconnected with the fact that we came from somewhere else and we are going somewhere else. And that this physical dimension of thoughts and behavior is like a temporary stopover, that when we only stay with the physical and we only stay with the nafs, then all of our psychology is going to be about nafs psychology. And it's not really going to involve the ruh, which is really the true identity of the human being, because the ruh had an existence before this life and the ruh will have an existence after this life. The nafs is something that is integral to that while we're here, but it's something that needs work, needs to be purified and will be taken into account. So, in modern Western secular psychology, there's still a notion of, well, people need to do work on themselves, right? But oftentimes that work is about changing our thoughts so that we can change outcomes. Whereas a spiritually oriented orientation to psychology is not necessarily trying to determine any outcome, but rather to be with what is and be in submission to the transcendent reality. And so, what all that comes down to is that we're constantly in this state of trying to come back to or come forward to remembering our true nature. Because we actually knew this before we came into this world. We just forgot it. And so all it is a process of the polishing is also a remembering and uncovering. And so that's how we transform from the stony nature to the ruby nature. But that's only possible if you even are aware of and aiming towards the light. You know, if you're in denial of the light and you're willfully blinding yourself to it or covering from it, then you're going to constantly be staying with the stoniness and be frustrated because that's not your whole nature. There's this whole other part of yourself that people can tend to ignore because they don't have a way of making sense of it in actuality and practicality and their understanding and working with themselves.
MashaAllah. I really love what you've said, and it sparks a lot for me. Um, I think one of the things that it'd be worthwhile to mention in relation to that is, and online we asked if people had questions that they'd like us to address. And one of the questions was, or a few of the questions were related to the history of Sufi psychology, Sufism in relation to the broader Islamic tradition, and things of that regard. So I wanted to say one thing and then hear your reflections. But I think a beautiful starting point is that one of the most famous hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is known as the Hadith Jibril, the Hadith of Gabriel. And it's a long hadith with so many dimensions. Most people here will have heard it. Um, and it's considered an encapsulation of the entire Islamic tradition. And in that, um, the angel Gabriel comes in the form of the man and asks the Prophet, peace be upon him, a number of questions. The first question is, what is Islam? And the Prophet answers with the five pillars. Then he asks, what is Iman? And the Prophet answers, to believe in God, to believe in the angels, to believe in the books, to believe in the the last day and the destiny and decree. He mentions the six articles of faith. And then the third question is, what is ihsan? What is ihsan? And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, famously answers, it is to worship God as if you see him. And if you do not see him, he sees you. And ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara fa'in lam takun tara innahu yarak. Now, from this hadith, the entire Islamic tradition, it's like a seed that carries the entire tree or forest of the tradition, you could say. And Islam relates to the acts that we all do, right? And in modern terms, you could say it relates to the body. It's how we interact in this world in our embodied nature, right? Not only how we pray and how we fast, but how we interact and how we transact and how we treat people and creatures and plants and animals. It relates to the embodied component. Iman is belief, which in modern terms, we might say the mind, right? So we have the body, the mind, relates to what you believe about the world, what we understand about this world, about the creator of this world, about the purpose of life. These are belief or these are faith. These are, you could say, theology and philosophy grows up out of this, whereas the sacred law grows out of the, the dimension of Islam. And the third dimension, right, which is the dimension of ihsan, is about the soul. It's about a state of being. It's about witnessing, to witness Allah, to experience the divine presence, to be in a certain spiritual state. And So if you think about the Islamic tradition historically, the domain of the sacred law, of the rights and the rules and the regulations and the rituals, that's the domain of Islam. The domain of Iman is the domain of theology and philosophy. And the domain of Ihsan, it really is the domain of Sufism, Tasawwuf. And one of the great early Sufi writers, Imam al-Qushayri, Allah be pleased with him, he wrote in his Risala, one of these seminal, foundational, canonical Sufi texts, in his definition of muraqabah, which Dr. Abdullah and I did a retreat on muraqabah recently. Muraqabah literally means to observe, to witness, to watch. And he starts it off with that hadith of Jibril and the part about ihsan. And he said, muraqabah is the maqam or the station of ihsan. In other words, to be in that state of presence and witnessing and observing your own soul and your own states and observing the divine reality. And if you can't experience that divine reality, know that that divine reality is witnessing you. And so these domains, and you use very beautifully, Dr. Abdullah, the word, this integral, integration, right? This is an integral whole, this tradition, Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. Now, when you take one of those dimensions out of Islam, you really don't have Islam. You have something else, but it's not Islam. And one of the challenges and troubles of the modern world is that people want to take Sufism out of Islam on both sides. People that don't like Sufism want to take it out of Islam, and people that like Sufism a lot want to take it out of Islam, right? And so we have this is why it's a contentious term. And even in the questions, right? We had even why didn't you say Islamic psychology? What does this mean? And you have these questions. And Dr. Abdullah, and I see him smile because we've had long conversations about this. But in reality, um, these are very deep and nuanced questions. But the reason that we call this course Sufi psychology is because it is very important for us to reclaim the spiritual dimension of our tradition, and not only to reclaim it and to study it and to engage it, but also to put it in conversation with our lived realities as modern people, because we live in a very different world than the world of Imam Ghazali or Maulana Rumi or the other great spiritual psychologists that wrote in their time. Now, on one hand, the human being is the exact same because we're all Beni Adam and our spirit is the same. However, the particular mindsets and the particular frames and the way we see the world, that superficial level, yes. But that level is very real. We see the world through our cultural context and things like that. So we have to be able to put in conversation these things so that we can study the wisdom of the ancients and understand that they had understandings that we have forgotten. This is one of the most important things, right? Unfortunately, the modern perception is that, you know, our ancestors were very ignorant and then slowly they got a little more intelligent. And then it's like smart us with iPhones and Chat GPT and now, right, and striped toothpaste and hydrogen bombs. And what can they really know before us, right? But this is hubris, and it really is, it only harms us because our ancestors had knowledge and understanding and wisdom that we have forgotten. And anyone who has spent any time with people that still maintain their pre-modern traditions will know this. There's this type of wellness and well-being and wisdom, and you could even say technology of the soul that they have that we're in need of. And so, I know we could say a lot about this, but I just wanted to mention, Dr. Abdullah, this is why I admire your work so much. And when we first met at the conference on Islamic psychology in California those years ago, we had those conversations because you're someone who's putting this, you've dedicated your life to putting these in conversation, to diving deep into this beautiful tradition of ihsan, the literature and the scholarship and the living tradition of tasawwuf, but then articulating it and putting it in conversation with the paradigms and the frames and the assumptions of modern psychology. So I know I just said a lot there, so maybe I'll just invite you to share any reflections you have, particularly as it relates to the importance of the work that you're doing, the work of Rumi Center, the work of a course like this, and its importance for making accessible these teachings.
Yeah, I think the whole idea, like you said just a few seconds ago, of this the technology of the soul, this like spiritual technology, I think is something that we have been disconnected from, and we find all kinds of people, Muslims, non-Muslims, modern people in general, looking for, how do I fix this? How do I tap in? What's the method, right? What's the methodology and what's the method? And so we go looking to all these other traditions, and we're looking for whether it's yoga and qigong and herbal medicine and Ayurveda, and all these things are like deep wisdom and hikmah, and they're beautiful. And at the same time, that all exists. Like there literally is a hikmah tradition in Islam, in the lineage of Islam, that has just been lost. And so there's a lot of people who are believing Muslims or interested in Islam, and what is being presented as Islam is the first of these three dimensions. Islam as an organized religion, the things you're supposed to do, the things you're not supposed to do. And like you said, it's not whole, but it's also not giving people the spiritual technology or the science of the soul that was always came along with it. And the way that people would learn the tradition and learn the deen, learn about Islam and all that it has to offer, was not just through books and study and ideas and theology, which now we've relegated it to this. But there was always ta'lim, which is the study of books and information, and tarbiyah. And tarbiyah is the development of the soul, the working, the struggling, the changing what is within ourselves, that has to go along with the ta'lim, the study, the understanding. But because we're modern people, and we see ourselves, even if we're Muslim or spiritual people, we still have been told that we're the severed head on the psychology book. And so all of our way of understanding and trying to fix and trying to is all just like shoving information into our mind or trying to change our thoughts. And we have completely disconnected from our bodies. And what happens is we think, oh, well, just bodies, that's just about physical health. No, the reason it's not just about physical health, why? Is because the heart is the center of the human being, not the mind. And the heart is in the body. It's literally infused, you could even say, in the body. And so the way that we can unlock these spiritual technologies is fundamentally through embodied development of our soul. And that's not going to be, let me understand this lecture and then go and apply this thinking to my life. It has to be something where you're actually sitting with your being and opening your heart on a physical level, because the metaphysical heart has a physical location in the chest. Allah in the Quran says it's not the eyes that go blind, it's the hearts in the chest. In the chest, right? So he's talking about the metaphysical heart, but he's giving us a physical location. And so when we sever our heads and everything's just about thinking and trying to understand and trying to fix our thoughts so that we can change our thoughts or change our behavior, we disconnect ourselves from this spiritual technology, which is integral to Islam. Like when a lot of people aren't turned on to this, so they read the Quran, they read lots of other things. But because I'm so turned on to this, when I read the Quran, all I see is like about how we're supposed to change what is within ourselves, and how we do that with the heart and through purification, and And it's all like very embodied and it's all very living in life and it's all very connected to nature and it's all all of our spiritual practices are all embodied and physical. And so the unpacking of that science of the soul just so happens that the people who really dug deep and wrote about it were the Sufis. And so to try to understand the psychology of what does Islam tell us about psychology, to try to do that without referencing the Sufi literature would be like uh, trying to understand a science just by like kind of looking at, without going to the source of the lineage of transmission of all this science that we have. And so what I think, based on what you said, is like, why are you calling this Sufi psychology? And in my work, everything that you'll see about my work, it's called Islamic psychology. Not because it doesn't fundamentally draw from tasawwuf, Sufism, but because that word Sufism, in many, particularly in the mainstream Muslim world, is totally misunderstood. And there's a lot of ignorance around it. And so as soon as you say that, people like start to attach all these other things to it that they think is somehow outside of the fold of Islam. But actual Sufism can't possibly be outside of the fold of Islam. Therefore, it would not be Sufism. It just wouldn't be, it can't be separated from Islam. And so I think why I support Sidi Baraka in this project and why calling it Sufi psychology is important is because people need to understand that this is an integral, again, in the word integral part of the tradition. So many people, everybody references fiqh, Islamic law, and people take that as if it came along with the Quran, but it didn't. Fiqh was developed through the reading of the Quran by scholars putting together a science. And fiqh even means deep understanding. It doesn't mean the application of things, you do this, you don't do that. It actually is a level of depth. But the fiqh as a science was developed at the very same time as tasawwuf was developed as a science. It just so happens that people have forgotten that and rejected it, very much so not because of anything within Islam, but because of modernity and because of something that happened only within the past 100 years. This is a new development. 100 years ago, it would be very hard to find a Muslim who had an issue with Sufism. I mean, it was minimal. And so I think the project here is like waking people up to realize that this is an integral part of the tradition, and that without looking at that literature and what all these scholars have done in the science of tasawwuf and the science of the soul, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Huge, to the point where I have this in my work, I have this iceberg model. And like I say that above the surface line is the nafs, and right below the water line is the aql, and then below that is the qalb, the heart. And then deep down in this depth of the water that we tend to ignore is the ruh. And I think that's kind of what people do, is that because it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And so people think, well, we don't know much about the ruh and we can't, and this ayah in the Quran is misunderstood, of like little is known about the ruh. The little that is known is a lifetime of knowledge. It's not a reason for you to say we don't need to go there. It's a reason for you got plenty to discover and understand. And it's really that little from among us know the depths of the ruh, not that it's not able to be known. And so this is, I think, my response to your question.
No, I appreciate that. And I think, people may or may not know, but Dr. Abdullah and I grew up in the same city. We didn't know each other, but we ran in similar circles. We were just a few years apart. So we didn't know each other until later. But I mentioned that to say we grew up in a very similar cultural milieu in Seattle, and then I was in the Bay Area. You were in New York. We were different places, but in a lot of circles, um, in a lot of communities of artists and of musicians and of seekers of various stripes, right? Sufism has very positive connotations. Whereas, and I've experienced in very interesting settings where I was in various gatherings when I said I'm a Muslim and people are like, oh. And or when I said I'm a Sufi, people are like, oh. Like very different responses, very interesting. Again, all of these at the end of the day, even very on in the Sufi tradition, there was this saying that almost became emblematic, which is that Sufism was a reality without a name, and it's become a name without a reality, which is so profound because it indicates that over time people become fixated on labels and identities, and they lose the essence of a thing. And when things become popular, they become watered down. And we don't need to start about, well, this is Rumi Center. We don't need to start to talk about the popular versions of Rumi and the fact that Brad Pitt has a Rumi tattoo on his arm, and this and Beyonce and Jay-Z named their child Rumi, and like it's in the zeitgeist. And those popular versions often bear little resemblance to the originals. So I think we can understand that, but we can also understand that in the popular discourse of Islam, what people are talking about is not what we would understand as Islam as well. And so I think it's really important for us to be people of depths and people that dig deep beneath the terms and get to the essence of what people are speaking about. And I think the point that you mentioned, I think, is really beautiful because Sufism, whether people love it or don't love it, is often associated with the whirling dervishes or with this love poetry or with um, dhikr and chanting or anything like any number of things like that. But at its essence, as you mentioned, it is ilm nafs. It is an understanding of the self, the levels of the self, which are from the Quran, right? The nafs al-amaru bisu, as mentioned in Surah Yusuf, nafs al-lawama, which is mentioned in Surah Qiyamah, nafs al-mutma'inna, all the levels of the self in this the spiritual psychology of Sufism, they're drawn directly from Quranic terms and Quranic realities, more importantly. And so the the important thing to do is to really get to putting back the soul in psychology, as you say. The modern, right? So psychology in Greek literally means study of the soul, as you mentioned, but then the soul is completely absent from modern psychology. But this beautiful tradition that we're speaking about, Islam, if we take the dimension of ihsan out of it, again, we've again divorced it from its true reality. And so in a certain sense, what we're talking about is bringing things back to their origin, bringing things back to their integral wholeness. And it's interesting, one of the words for integral or wholeness in Arabic is salim, which comes from the same root, sin lam mim, as salam and Islam itself. And it's used in the Quran twice to refer to the heart, biqalbin salim, man ata Allah biqalbin salim, the day when neither wealth nor progeny will benefit anyone except for the one who returns to Allah biqalbin salim, with an integral heart, with a whole heart, with a healthy heart, a health that is whole. And it's interesting because salam, peace, is related. You only attain peace when you become whole. When you feel disintegrated, which is interesting, disintegrated, when you disintegrate, you can't be at peace. And Islam is, again, the state of surrender of the separateness to the wholeness, to the divine reality, to the one, to the oneness. And so that state of peace that comes from that surrender leading to wholeness, it's all there. And so I think it's really important to mention that while in popular conception, Sufism could be associated with these wild dervishes who are dancing or doing these type of things. And even in the Muslim world, a lot of people have a lot of negative perception about Islam, and they think, oh, these are people that kiss graves or dance or whatever. But in the pre-modern Islamic world, as you mentioned, it was almost impossible to find a person who was not associated with a Sufi order. And ironically, it's a legacy of colonization that separates Sufism from Islam because the Orientalists were the first ones. Because the Orientalists, we don't need to get too deep into this, is a different conversation, but it's important to understand the origin of it. When the Europeans first came to study the Islamic world, they had this idea that the Semitic peoples, they're law bound and legalistic, and they're not capable of higher level abstraction, philosophy, and poetry. This was their like this was their perception. And so when they found higher level philosophy and poetry and mysticism in the Islamic tradition everywhere, they said, "Oh, this must have come from somewhere else." Sufism it's not really from this arid desert Semitic religion. It couldn't have been. It's a legalistic religion. It must have come from somewhere else. And so this was their claim. And of course, those then reform movements who came later in the last 100, 200 years from within the Islamic world took that line of thinking to claim that Sufism isn't a part of Islam. And they were reacting, how come we've fallen behind civilizationally? It must be because we need to get back to the pure Islam and bypass 1400 years, and then we can know, as if we can bypass everything our ancestors said and know what the earliest ancestors taught. That's a whole different conversation, but it also is um, important to mention. Now, I thought this was a funny question that came in, so Dr. Abdallah wanted to hear what you have to say about this. I know you'll have something interesting to say about this. Are spiritual psychologists sheikhs, and is a sheikh a spiritual psychologist?
Yeah, the former, not necessarily, and the latter, yes, absolutely. So all spiritual psychologists are not necessarily shayukh because that depends on their maqam, their station, their transmission, their sanad or lineage of teaching and transmission. But the real shayukh, like we look at the awliya that we read about, or that some of us have had the blessing to be able to sit at the feet of. Like I have experiences sitting at the feet of shayukh, and I've watched them. They're master spiritual psychologists. They have all of the knowledge, like they can recite the isnad of any hadith and tell you what is the answer within, these different four madhabs to this fiqh question. They have all that knowledge, but primarily when somebody's coming to them, they're doctors of the soul, and they're giving medicine to each individual based on what they see in their soul. And so but that doesn't mean that somebody who's a psychologist and has studied psychology and then is now incorporating a recognition of the spiritual person, that doesn't mean that they're operating at the level of a sheikh, nor should they, nor should it be so. It's such a binary, it's like either they're a sheikh or they can't deal anything with the soul or the spiritual reality. That's just a ridiculous notion, because that's like saying, well, I'm gonna call myself a psychologist. First of all, that's just ironic if you're not going to deal with the soul. And then when the person comes to me, even though the biggest part of their identity is their spiritual identity and their soul, I'm going to just ignore it. And I'm only going to deal with the thoughts and the behaviors. But if you understand, and the reality is, whether you understand it or not, that all of that is integral. So we need to be able to have a space for people to integrate the spiritual aspect of the human being within trying to help somebody through what they're dealing with, without it needing to have all these bars around, okay, well, then that's in the realm of a sheikh. And so I have a whole, uh, I touch on this in my research, and I have a whole article with a model of how to differentiate between a Sufi sheikh and a Islamic psychologist, and where the different parameters are for that. But so yeah.
That's beautiful. Maybe we can share that with people that are interested. I think, you know, another thing to mention, and people actually asked in relation to the class that we have coming up, is this taught by a particular, in the perspective of a specific lineage or tariqa or Sufi order, or, you know, these kind of questions. And um, these are valid and beautiful questions. It's important to mention that the there were no Sufi orders for the first basically 600 or so years of Islam. Really, in the 1200s of the Common Era, 600s of or 700s of the Islamic era, the Hijri calendar is when the orders were founded. And so the science of tasawwuf, the science, the discipline, precedes the Sufi orders. In other words, the Sufi orders grow out of the science. The science doesn't grow out of the orders. It's really important. The whole literature. And so there's two, you know, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad once said to me, there's the early Sufism and then later Sufism. In early Sufism, it was more informal. There were masters that were known as basically these great spiritual psychologists, just as you would go to a master of fiqh or a master of theology. And sometimes they would be the same person who mastered all those things, by the way. But you would go to a specialist and you would sit with them and you would benefit and you would, right? Imam al-Junaid was someone like this, right? You would take from them, you would draw wisdom from them, and you would often take from others. You would sit in various circles. Now, at a certain point, these orders were founded really just to systemize and support various schools, just to support, just like schools of Islamic law developed, to systematize so that these ways could be preserved and could be taught in a systematic way. But the important thing is that the Sufi order, if you think about its function, like a zawiya or a khanaqa or a tekke, right? These different terms, derga, all these terms for the same. It's like a kind of like the lodge, the Sufi lodge, which was different than a masjid. It was kind of like what people talk about now, a third space, you know? It was a place where people would gather and they would implement the spiritual teachings in community, because there's also an understanding that we actually need feedback, and it helps to be with people that are similarly striving to implement these things. So Imam al-Ghazali wrote in the Ihya very beautifully, right? Which is, you know, almost 1,000 years ago, he wrote this. He said, the best thing you can do for your spiritual progress is to be with a spiritual guide, someone who has arrived to the divine presence, right? A real spiritual psychologist in that sense of a Sufi sheikh. He said, however, in our time, such people are exceedingly rare. Exceedingly rare. 1,000 years ago, we think that was the flourishing golden age. They were everywhere. He said, however, if you can't find a person like that, or you can't be with a person like that all the time, the second best thing you can do is to be with sincere companions on the path who are striving to implement these teachings. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be arrived, awakened masters, but they're really striving. And then together, You will polish each other and you'll support each other and you'll grow together and you'll learn. And so what an order is a gathering space for people to implement this practice of presence, of devotion, of sincerity, of honesty, of polishing the heart and working together with a shared framework. And so the question I'd love to ask you, Dr. Abdullah, and this kind of gets to the work that you're doing at Dar al Shifa, the work that we're trying to do, intending to do at Rumi Center, is not create a tariqa, right? We each have our connections to our lineages and our teachers. But one thing that we've understood from our teachers is that in the contemporary time and in the modern world, especially as Westerners, most of us are, but even if not, the modern world is everywhere. It's very hard to avoid. Um, what we don't want to do is like silo ourselves on, like I'm in this order, you're in this order, and it becomes another identity thing or an ego thing. What we're trying to do is like, look, we're already as Muslims small minorities. And then people of Tasawwuf were minorities within that. And then we're going to separate further. You're Qadri, you're Shadili, you're this, Tijani. La, kayf. What we want to do is come together and unite upon the shared teachings and shared wisdom of our tradition and to be able to put it in conversation. But then, and this is the key part that I'm getting at, is to cultivate community of shared applied spirituality. Right? We're not calling to any tariqah. We're not calling to any, right? We all have different teachers. Abdullah and I, we were raised by different teachers and some of the same teachers and different orders and some of the same orders, and it's all love. Like the brotherhood is deep and the shared reference points are all there. And that's what they always say, that your sheikh is your father or your mother, and the other sheikhs are your uncles and your aunties, right? So yes, you have your father and your mother. But those are your uncles and your aunties. You better respect them, you know, and you take good from them, and they're going to give you things that your parent wouldn't give you as well. They can give you something that your parent, because of that relation, is different. So I just wanted to, kind of give you that open question to reflect on cultivating community and community of people really striving to draw near to the divine and put into practice this work on the self.
Yeah, I think just like Imam al-Ghazali's, um, like you referenced, even in his time, it was rare to find a sheikh. And so he's saying that that's ideal. That's ideal. But because it's rare, you can't say, well, if I don't have that, then I can't do this, or I can't walk the path, or I'm left out. And he said you also can't just be alone. You need another person, you need a group of people, and this is that position you mentioned, the Rafiq. And what people I think need to remember and often forget, because we're so focused on a personality as a sheikh, is the sheikh only ever is a connection to the Prophet ﷺ, as everybody's sheikh. Like all of us have one guide, and he is still guiding us. And nobody's cut off from that, ever. And no affiliation with any other individual human being makes any difference to that. You're still all that. Any good sheikh, any sheikh's position is only to put your hand in their hand, and that the Prophet's hand is above their hand, and that your sheikh's hand was in the hand of somebody whose hand was in the hand of the Prophet. That's all it is. It's a link in an unbroken chain to the guide that we all have and that we can tap into today, now, in a living reality in our lives. And so I think we all need to remember that reading the seerah, the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the shama'il, like learning about the Prophet, these are ways of inculcating a visceral living connection with your guide. Like that is what the deen of Islam is. It's why we say La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah. That's the path. It's not anything else. All of the different tariqas are just ways because it's very hard sometimes for people to make a connection with somebody who's not in front of them, right? And so you need another human being to like imprint on, just like we do as babies with our parents. But I'm telling you, most of the people who even have a sheikh these days very rarely even get to see them or even ask them questions about their life. They're left with like maybe seeing them once a year with a group of hundreds of other people and maybe getting 10 minutes with them. So it's still, we everyone is like, oh, I need a shake, I need a shake, I wish I had a shake, but you may not be getting what you envision, and most likely not getting what people got in the past. And that's the reality that we're living in. Now, does that mean that Allah has somehow abandoned us in the desert without guidance? No, not at all. Allah specifically sent to us the Prophet for all times, for all people, until the end of this dispensation of this world. And so, more important than anything is to tie our hearts together, tied to the Prophet as our Shaykh. And anybody else that does anything other than connect you to the Prophet is not a true Shaykh anyway. So I think we need to understand the benefit of tasawwuf as a science and tariqah as a beautiful and living reality, but it's not the same times. The times are different now. And so I think we can't have this like stark holding on to things as they used to be and thinking it only in these dimensions. Like the shayukh that I have studied from, who come from these lineages of tariqah, literally have told me this is a different time. What was the protocol before is no longer as relevant now. It doesn't mean you throw out the whole thing, but it means it has to be adapted to these times. And so what it means is like, just because people can't find a sheikh in that same way doesn't mean you're left on your own. And so this is where community becomes really important. And that fighting against the fitna of like these people and that tariqah and that tariqah. And we should all be gathering together under the banner of the Prophet, but also the banner of like the guidance within Islam and the guidance within tasawwuf as something that is, so there was a question here, I think, like, can somebody follow the Sufi path without a sheikh? It's a great question. And there's many people who would answer that and say, absolutely not. You cannot follow the path of Sufism without a sheikh. And in some ways, that's a correct answer. And in other ways, it's a very incorrect answer because that would be unjust. And Allah is al-adl. And so if the guidance is for you, you are going to be given the guidance just by having the intention. And so what's most important is that we remember that and we don't get sort of sidetracked and disintegrated, and we need to focus on the integration with one another and recognizing that Sufism is Islam, Islam is Sufism. It's all within the same thing. It's all the path of surrender.
Beautiful. So I think there's a little bit of time if people wanted to ask questions. So if people want to raise their hands in there, we can maybe take a few questions. But I also wanted, in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, one question came in the chat that I wanted to read. Dr. Abdullah said, you will be frustrated if you are just trying to focus on working on your nafs, meaning you are just trying to change your behavior and thoughts. So the question is, how do you work on your nafs without this frustration? Meaning, what would be a way to polish the nafs, focusing on, as you said, the light? I recognize the way of tasawwuf and tariqas will say to focus on dhikr, muraqabah, tadabbur, tafakkur, reflection, Quran, etc. Is this a way to create less frustration with the nafs, though? So I think this essence of this question is an orientation to this work because we all get overcome by our nafs. And sometimes spiritual work and the state, it can actually, we can have maybe an unhealthy relationship even to our own spiritual practice and maybe even some of the literature and some of the terms, right? Break your nafs and kill your nafs and die before you die. And like, these can actually contribute to like, oh, I'm so terrible. I should destroy myself. And, you know, so maybe you could speak to that.
I mean, I think the best way I can speak to that is saying that the frustration is the path.
Mm,
You can't do it without the frustration, nor should that be the goal.
mm,
It's about being with what is. And if frustration is what's with you, that's the only door you can walk through. You cannot go around it. You cannot try to get rid of it. So if you have frustration, if frustration is the water you're swimming in, swim. Like start treading water. And what I mean by that is don't turn away from the frustration. Don't think that it shouldn't be there because La ilaha illallah. There is no source of anything happening other than Allah, including the frustration. And so if you want Allah, the way to be with Allah is to be with what Allah is manifesting in your life, even if it's frustration, especially if it's frustration.
that's really beautiful. And when you were saying that, that one of the hikam of Ibn Ata'Allah came to mind. I think it was one of the first ones, if not the first one, but he mentions an insight around this too that also can help us maybe as we feel that frustration to have a healthy relationship to frustration, which I hear you actually speaking about, where he says, um, to paraphrase, if you become too overcome and like dejected and let down every time you make a mistake, it's a sign that you're relying too much on yourself. Right? In other words, we're weak. Like we're not perfect. We make mistakes. And we can't overcome that by ourselves, like just by imposing this strict regimen on ourselves. That's not right. We have to give it up to Allah and we have to strive. And so that's that balance of striving, but also being like, because the flip side of this is what if I start doing a lot of good? Then do I think, oh, this is me doing it? Right? Because another hikam is it is better for you to make a mistake or a sin that humbles you than to do a good deed that makes you proud. Right? So this is the path. This is where it's at. And we know, like, we talk about a true spiritual community. We all see ourselves as in need of growth and right. Unfortunately, an unhealthy a toxic spiritual community. I'm probably not the only one who walked into a mosque that felt like that. Is where people are like, "You're doing the wrong thing, and you said the wrong thing, and you're dressed the wrong way," and like everybody's like, "Whoa, you don't even know me. You don't even haven't even given any indication that you care about me, but you want to like." Right? So that is the true spiritual community is people are focused on growing and supporting each other's growth. No.
Yeah, it's the path of mercy. Like every mercy is the beginning and end of everything in Islam. It's the first thing that Allah calls himself by is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. And we have to be merciful with ourselves because Allah is merciful with us, and we have to be merciful with one another. And unfortunately, not only is it not when we walk in the mosque, many of us have been taught Islam in a way that was unmerciful. And so our whole relationship with the deen needs healing.
Beautiful. So in the chat, Alia asked, and we mentioned that this course that's coming is going to explore these themes. How do we move beyond the limitation of the lower self? How can we cultivate inner stillness and spiritual inner sight? And what are the diseases of the heart and their cures? Obviously, in a short time, we can't get too deep into all of these, but I think just the beginning of this is really beautiful is in this framework and in your work, how do we cultivate inner stillness and spiritual insight?
By learning how to be in our bodies. Like the modern world disconnects us from our bodies all the time. And the way to do that is to be in tune with fitra, the natural state. The natural state of your body is to be relaxed, right? The reason why you're not relaxed is because you're doing unnatural things. You're worried about things that aren't in your control, and you're spending all your time thinking, and you're not spending time in nature. And the way to be aligned with fitra is why, like, there was another question here. How come there's so much in the Quran that's not about Sufism? It's about like all the things we're supposed to be doing. Because you don't, if you're just, if for many at a different time when it wasn't, we didn't live in this modern world where we're told that everything's our responsibility. There was just, people just understood that God was in control of things, and that was more of a adi, it was more regular understanding. And within that realm, that paradigm, kind of all you need to do is just do what's good for you, do what you're supposed to do, and things will fall in line, fall in order. But we're so discombobulated and disaggregated from that notion that the answer to this question is as simple as go outside more, spend more time in nature. I just went for the weekend for one night camping, just like out in the woods, and I prayed all my prayers outside, like by a mountain, hearing birds, hearing the wind. And I just, it just, every time I do that, it occurs to me like, it's so hard not to be in a state of khushu when you're in nature. It's not because I'm successful, not because of me. Like literally, the atmosphere around me is forcing me to be at peace and at rest. And that's why the Prophet, they thought some spend most of his time outdoors. He spent time in the cave. He spent time working with his hands. He spent time riding horses. Like that's not all just archaic things in the past. And it's why he told us to do these things. They put us back in alignment. And they literally connect you with your body. They literally connect you with your breath. So all the things that we do now, like breath work and yoga and meditation and sitting, those are all just things that you have to do if you're not riding horses, spending time in caves, praying on the dirt, and walking a lot.
Hmm. I think that's really important. And I really second that. So I got a couple messages that are related. Zuleika asked, I found it most vexing that many people have a view of Allah being about punishment. My father taught us what we've been saying, that Allah is love and mercy. And Lena asked, how do we heal if someone grew up with an unhealthy relationship with Allah and His Prophet? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I think these are related questions about the fact that a lot of the way that religion is taught in the modern world, and it's not just in Islam. Um, I come from a Christian background, and you have the same thing that a lot of people grow up in the church where they feel a similar thing, but that there's not a holistic teaching that embodies the love and the mercy. So, how would you answer that, Dr. Abdullah?
It's through experience. People are conditioned
Mhm.
through experience. Like their experience of human beings is imprinted on them. So if you're around people as a young child, people who are not merciful and not reflecting the mercy of Allah and not showing you love, then you hold that within you and then you project that onto Allah. And then there's this um, this conditioned response. And so the way to heal that is to have to condition. It's not going to happen just through restructuring thoughts. You can't
Mm,
just study kalam or aqidah and sort out your theology and have it fix itself because all that damage was on your heart, wasn't in your mind. And so the heart has to open, and oftentimes it has to open to the very things that we're closing it off to because it's painful. And we're protecting our heart because it wasn't safe before. And so what you have to do is you have to find places of safety, which again is the suhba, the community, and the rafiq, the companionship. The whole idea of companionship is creating a container of safety for the sake of Allah, for the sake of growth and development. And in that brotherhood and sisterhood, you need to reveal your heart. You need to be vulnerable. Your heart needs to come back online in those places where it got offline, meaning you closed up because it wasn't safe or because there wasn't mercy and there wasn't love, and then it's just crusted over. And so to heal it, it has to open, but then while it's open, there has to be a connection to Allah. And that connection to Allah, because it usually is damaged with people, needs to also be fixed with people. So you need to be around loving, merciful people who are reflecting the light of Allah to remind that part of your stone that it's a ruby.
mm, beautiful. Um, so I asked a question around field of trauma release and trauma, and I think this is a. I'm really happy that this was asked because I actually wanted to reflect, and I know we've had conversations about this in the past, but I was thinking about recently um, the fact that all this literature that I've been studying for the last 20 years of the pre-modern Sufi tradition, which is basically, as we've been saying, knowledge of the self, what holds the self back from attaining its true purpose and wholeness and happiness and well-being. The word trauma or even the idea trauma is basically absent from the literature. To my knowledge, I haven't come across it in 20 years. If it's there, I haven't seen it. And it's fascinating because the whole thrust of not only like psychology as a discipline, but now it's kind of trickled into just the common discourse of human beings and people in the West of like my trauma, this traumatic experience, I had this, right? And I think it's really interesting. And one of the thoughts that I've been like wrestling with, and I want to pose this to you, but just to kind of like share a little bit of how I've been thinking about this in my own reflection is that for some reason there was a level of resiliency that we don't have as modern people. And some of the reasons that I could say, one is you beautifully just mentioned the way that people like were in the earth and riding horses and people were in the land and people were, you know, rising with the sun and going to sleep when it got dark, and people were really living this natural cycle of existence and witnessing the stars, and that's that first level of nature. But then second, and I would say even probably more importantly, they were really embedded in community, another thing we've been talking about, right? They lived with people. They didn't do life alone. They grieved together. They celebrated together. They wept together. They laughed together. They cried together. They prostrated together. They made offerings together. It was all this togetherness. And so, whatever you went through, there was this deep network of support that you just took for granted. And everyone that you knew was around you. It wasn't like they were in a far off place on a screen. They were in you could hug them, they could grab you, they could hold you, they could squeeze you. You hear them breathe and you hear them sigh and that. And then the third piece, which maybe even is more important than all of those, is to live in an enchanted universe with like a sacred canopy of meaning. Everything had meaning. And there was an understanding of what to do when someone is born, and what to do when dies, and what to do when someone is married, and what to do when someone comes of age and goes through rites of passage. Everything was embedded in cycles of meaning, and everything had meaning. And so, whatever happened to you, even very difficult experiences, the rupture was different. The way that it felt in the body, the way that it lasted, the way that you dealt with it, the way that it affected you seemed to be different, because there wasn't this deep emphasis that whatever happened or how my parents related to me or what their relationship with or the family dynamics, that is going to define how you are in your future relationships and how you relate to the divine, and all that this psychological literature now that we almost take for granted because it's just in our culture. But I also don't want to discount certain insights, because clearly we can all think of the ways that experiences in our lives really have impacted us, and some of them really deeply, and some of them really impact our ability to trust or open up to a person after we've had a difficult experience in our childhood or maybe later. So I don't want to discount and be like none of that has reality. Really, what I'm curious is just your thoughts, because I know you've thought a lot about this, and some of the reasons why it wasn't framed the same way in our traditionally, and it is being framed this way in modern psychology.
Yeah, I think you said it all. I mean, that's it. It's that there wasn't a notion of separateness. There wasn't a notion of individualism. There wasn't a notion of I'm responsible and I'm gonna bear the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I've got to pick myself up by my bootstraps and create my own destiny, and I've got to, like that's in a realm and a world and a paradigm where that's just not a thing, then it's not, you're not impacted from what we're talking about. Trauma is a rupture of your disconnection from not being able to absorb it in the whole, right? And so when you're connected to connectedness and unicity through community, through nature, through all, riding a horse, another being, all these things that are like connecting you to the transcendent, the thing that's not just about you as an individual being, then it's still a reality. You can still get thrown off course in your individuality, because we all have enough. So we all have this individual experience. But if you can then quickly be like, Allah, and then go be with the community, or ride a horse or do archery, it immediately or very fairly quickly reintegrates, and boom, 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 you're back, right? And so the same thing is happening. We're not having more traumatic events. People saw horrible disasters, people killed right in front of them. Still the same intensity of trauma, except they had the tools and the paradigm with which allowed them to absorb it all. Whereas we're just totally disconnected from all those things. We don't even see the connection because of the severed head on the psychology book. And so we're just trauma. We don't have anywhere to integrate it, even in our own being, because our heads are not connected to our bodies. So we have to first connect it to the rest of the totality of our own being, which the Prophet ﷺ even told people to do. Like, he told the Sahaba to practice archery after coming off the battlefield, not because they were bad at archery, but because it was so that they don't have post-traumatic stress disorder. They just saw people killed in front of them. And so he tells them to do this thing, that they're focused on one thing, they're focused on their body, they're in their breath, they're opening the meridians on the channels of their trapezius muscles where we carry things, and it all opens that up and it integrates it into the body. Boom, no more trauma. The traumatic event still happened, still extremely traumatic. Had they not done these practices, they would have had what we now call PTSD. But all these spiritual technologies are connected to this larger worldview. And we just need to reconnect to all of those things: the community, the local economy, the riding horses, the doing archery, the swimming, they're all integral to our human experience.
Hmm. See, I'm gonna raise your hand. Bismillah.
Bismillah, I just wanted to add that for a lot of people, if you're living in an urban environment, access to nature is about privilege, it's about wealth, it's even healthcare. And I'd also mention that if you look at the traditional Sufi literature, they have practices that are dealing with trauma. For example, when you look at trauma literature, one of the most effective therapies is repetitive rhythmic movement. So the whirling dervishes, or the hadra, or the chant, the dhikr. So we had all of this in our spiritual practice. So it just naturally, the science is just catching up to what Sufis were traditionally doing. And so, it's also about the modern world, this world where pharmaceutical industry, it pushes trauma. How will the pharmaceutical industry run if it doesn't have everyone on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication? So they fuel the trauma literature. It goes much deeper if you really look into it. And Islam sort of cuts through the illusions of everything. A lot of us came to Islam because we tried everything else and it didn't work. And so it's all there in the
Nothing over
tradition.
here, right, sis? Nope, no thing.
Yeah,
Nope.
that's all I have to add.
Front, behind.
Alhamdulillah.
It's all there
Beautiful.
within. We have it all. It's like it's all there to be discovered. I love the Rumi Center for this because it reminds us of what we have, the treasure we've lost.
Beautiful, Amna. Thank you so much. And that's I think that's very wise. And I think, you know, um there's a atheist philosopher, Alain de Botton. He wrote this book some years ago called Religion for Atheists. He's an interesting thinker because he loves religion, but he doesn't believe in it. And basically, his whole thing is like, we've secularized so badly. Like, religion did everything right, except for the whole belief in God thing. But look what it provided for people as far as community and meaning, these great cathedrals and structures and rituals and right. So he's like, it's profound because he doesn't believe in it, but he's like, oh my God. Like, look at all this depression and suicide and anxiety and separation and isolation, right? He doesn't see that if you don't have Tawheed, then everything is downstream of that. If you lose Tawheed, all you have is takfir. You have just everything is disintegrating, right? It's just disintegrating. And you see our societies disintegrating. I mean, you see the political discourse in in the country that I'm from, and even globally, you see it a lot of places. It's all downstream of a loss of Tawheed. If we lose this integration and this oneness, and so may Allah use us as people that connect and unite and bring people together and bring ourselves together and become integrated and become truly connected. Um, so we've been going for an hour and a half. Uh, I want to close soon. See, Sarah, you had your hand raised. Sarah, do you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you firstly. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. How can be balance between body and soul, right? You can hear me?
Balance between body and soul.
And how we can practice our inner muraqabah, not
Abdallah, you
just
want to take
practice
that?
but life. And thank you for listening to. It's a very beautiful community together to remember Allah together. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Sarah. See, Abdallah, you want to speak about that?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. What is the what
Said
between
balance between body and soul and practicing muraqabah.
yeah, the balance is in understanding that the body is the soul. The body is a dense manifestation of the soul. This is what our soul looks like in this dimension. It has physical matter, but we need to embody ourselves in a way that recognizes that we are first and foremost spiritual beings. So in order to balance the soul, you have to be in your body. You have to pray physically, put your hand on the ground, wash your body, eat healthy food. Like, we have to understand that the care for the body and the being fully in the world is the care for the soul and being in the soul and the spiritual world. They're not separate. And so the balance is already there. There isn't a balance that needs to come to happen. It's just we need to be aware of and be operating from the place of balance, so that every time we eat food, we recognize it's both nourishing our body and feeding its light for our soul. Every time we wash with wudu, we recognize that there's a cleanliness factor on the germs, but there's also a light in our soul that is in the same place where my hand is when the water comes on it. And the things that I touch physically are also going to impact my metaphysical heart. And so we have to just live with this awareness that it is in balance and that it is integral.
Beautiful. I'm just going to close with these two questions, and then we have just we want to share some upcoming things. One about the course, also a retreat coming up. People have been asking, and then want to let Dr. Abdullah share some exciting news about what he has going on. But first, I'll mention these two questions. So, Dr. Abdullah, maybe you could reflect. Bilal asks, how do we connect and support people who see trials continuing to come from God? They know these trials are a test and a sign of God's love, but they say that they can't handle it, and they feel they're slipping down a slope leading to potential kufr. They are difficult to talk to. They struggle to see any goodness anywhere at all. I'd love to learn how to support people who are pretty deep in a spiritual ditch.
It's a deep ditch. I don't know if we have time to go deep into the ditch, but I would say in a simple answer, um, easy, bring ease to them, both by like, don't play into the notion that they have to figure it all out, or they have to have all the answers, or they have to pull themselves completely out of the ditch. Like, just jump in the ditch with them and be like, alhamdulillah, like, yeah, this is really tough. I feel you. It's very hard. And like, I'm here for you in this difficulty. And let's just focus on one small thing at a time. Like, whether that's your mercy for them, or whether it's like, what positive attributes does this ditch offer? It can be protection from something else. Like when you're in the ditch, it feels like horrible because you're not out of the ditch, but it's also maybe protecting you from something. So what I'm saying is like small focused things on what's positive, so that you can train the person towards seeing the hikmah in everything, but trying to like go to this big thing, there's a reason for everything and Allah is out there, and this just, it's not relatable. But if like, hey, I have a piece of bread to eat today, or I have eyelids to blink my eyes with, uh we're supposed to look at people who have less than us, not people that have more than us. And that is again, a spiritual technology for how to get back to balance. And it's something that like positive psychology has now just discovered, but Islam and the Prophet ﷺ and our scholars have taught this for a long time, that we should keep positive thoughts in our mind and think of small positive things, just like you would keep a medicine cabinet for when an ailment comes, you can pull on that. So, you know, helping people just focus on what good do you have, what good can you think of? It will help build towards that, but not trying to deal with it all at once. It's not realistic.
Beautiful. And the last question, to kind of paraphrase a longer question, is related to uh, practicing Islam or Sufism and other religions or contemplative practices. And I'll just say like a more personal anecdote, because and Abdullah can speak for himself, but I know a bit about his life, and we had very parallel journeys in the sense of going through seeking for truth and meaning and experiencing various different paths and practices and communities and traditions, until we came into Islam through the door of Sufism. Um, and the thing that I came to personally is that I was one of these individuals, like so many in our time, who had kind of created my own practice, approaching the wisdom of the different wisdom traditions like a buffet. So I take a little bit of, meditation from the Buddhists, yoga from the Hindus, Sufi poetry from Islam, XYZ, and creating my own dish. And I did that for a number of years in my teenage years, but I came to this really profound point. It led me to actually experience that there was this profound separation between these like ideals that I had and my lived reality. And I realized that it struck me in this really visceral way through some of my own like decisions and actions and things that I was like, what am I doing? Where I felt, oh, I need to surrender myself to something beyond myself. Because what I'm doing is like, I'm making the religion of my nafs, right? Because I want this and I want this and I want this. And now it's all what I want. The nafs is not going to choose what transcends the nafs or transforms the nafs. It's really about a type of surrender and submission. And so I would say that, and even in the various spiritual orders of our tradition, they say like, yes, take wisdom everywhere, but you ultimately should like submit to one path and one practice. And if you're just like going everywhere, it's kind of like the person who, wants to dig a well. They dig a little bit here, then they go dig a little bit here, then they dig a little bit here. They never actually hit water. Like just stay where you are and dig, right? If you're gonna, or even like someone who, has an exercise regimen and they're like, well, I want to try a little bit of this regimen and then this regimen. And then they never stick with anything and they stay out of shape. Whereas someone would actually stick with one of the regimens, whatever it is, would get in shape. And so my point being here is, I would say that on one hand, people go through when you're new, maybe you should experience different orders and different tariqas and like, oh, this is the one that speaks to me. This is the teacher that speaks to me. And maybe people that are in the spiritual seeker phase, even with religions, like I needed to go through that, right? I know Abdallah needed to go through that. We actually experience different traditions and different practices. But if you stay stuck in that and you just become like a syncretist, I've never seen that end well. I've never seen that end well. I've seen the people that really deepen and really mature and really grow, people that commit themselves to a path, commit themselves to a practice. So anyway, that's just my general thought. I don't know, Abdallah, if you wanted to add anything before we close.
No.
All right, Sami, I see a last hand, so we'll take this last question.
Thank you. Yeah, so that what you just said resonates a lot with me because I, have done the whole meditation practice and did a Vipassana 10-day retreat and whatnot, and I was finding it to be helpful to be practicing that. And then, I went on this retreat with Dr. Messin Athasi, and he was just such a beautiful soul, and it made me reflect on maybe I could do a form of dhikr, and that is a way of getting closer to Allah, um, while also having some mindfulness practice. So I'm just curious if you have found like I mean I hate to get analytical, but like almost like a mapping between this meditation that the Eastern world is doing, or for example like the yoga and um two practices that are embedded in an Islamic foundation.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. And, you know, before I became Muslim, I, you know, spent some time in studying like Tibetan Buddhism meditation as well as a bit of Zen and different contemplative practices. And there are overlaps for sure. Abdullah and I, we actually did a whole retreat. Actually, one of the reasons we've done these Muraqabah retreats and programs online is exactly for people like you. And exactly what you just said is that I think the Buddhists have done a much better job than us of making the contemplative practices of their tradition accessible to people in the modern world. You don't have to be a monk. Traditionally, I mean, Vinny Ferrero is a friend of mine who's a Buddhist teacher in America. He said if you go to the traditional Buddhist world, like the lay people are not meditating, right? The monks are meditating, the lay people aren't. But he said, interesting in the West, when Buddhism comes to the West, there's this different thing where very few people become monks, but they become really interested in meditation. So it's like this, they're not exactly like lay people or monks. It's this whole different thing. And that speaks to the different needs of a society. And so in our tradition, all the great manuals of spirituality, of Sufism, they have chapters on muraqabah, on meditation, on tadabbur, on reflection, contemplation, all these meditative techniques, dhikr. But how do we make these accessible to people like yourself, like myself, that are in the modern world? And so um, I think you have to come to one of the Muraqabah retreats. We don't have that long to get into this, but I will just direct you to. I did a conversation with Imam Mendes, Adinka Mendes, on the Path and Present podcast about Muraqabah. So that's there. And I think actually on the Muraqabah website, which I forget what it is, Christina can share, you can actually access, if people want to access the lectures from the last meditation retreat that Abdullah and I did, as well as the guided meditation. And I know actually, and we'll let Abdullah in a moment share about Dar al Shifa, his organization, but I know there's some guided meditations that are available there too. So basically, to suffice it just to say in a few words that there are overlaps, but there's a profound, profound tradition of meditation within our tradition. And it's one of our intentions to make that more accessible and to practice that together.
I put a link in the chat to there's a whole library of guided meditations that you can access that are exactly what you say, like similar to what you're used to with meditation, and it has guided, but it's all within the Islamic framework.
Just like that.
So with that, I think Christina, if we were going to share just a few slides to close. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll close with the dua at the end. But before, I just wanted to mention a few of the upcoming things that we have. First of all, we have the Sufi psychology course that's starting May 12th, so it's starting in just a few weeks. If anybody's interested in these topics, I think you'll really enjoy it. If you visit rumicenter.love, it goes over the topics that are covered. It's 8 weeks. We cover the spiritual dimension, the psychological dimension of our tradition, talk about the levels of the nafs, the heart, the spiritual heart, the ruh, a lot of the things that we've touched on. And we try to, again, make it accessible. Dr. Abdullah is a really important part of this course. He's a guest teacher. There's a recorded lecture, and he'll also be joining live because he brings this important experience as a clinician, as a psychologist. Of course, we're looking at psychology in the literal word of it, of study of the soul. This isn't just for clinicians or people that are interested in mental health practitioners. People that aren't interested in those fields, I think, will find benefit in this. But we've really created this for anyone who wants to understand their own soul, their own self, and purify their heart and draw near to their creator from within the Sufi tradition. So we have Abdallah A. Halwa, the really renowned author. We also have a recorded conversation with her, as well as our dear friend and elder, Michael Harun Sugic. In his conversation, he speaks about the importance of a spiritual guide. And he's written this beautiful, beautiful book called Exemplars, talking about his experience with the great spiritual guides and spiritual masters and spiritual psychologists of our tradition. And Ahelwa, in her really like from the heart way, speaks about divine love and the practical ways to walk the path. So everybody's welcome to join us. And we hope that this will be our second time running it. We ran it last spring as well. And I think you'll enjoy that. Alhamdulillah. So the second thing is people have been asking us about our retreats this year. Now, last year we did 5 retreats. So Rumi Center has been taking a little retreat from retreats because, alhamdulillah, it was beautiful, but it was full on. So this year this will be the only retreat we're doing. And this is our flagship retreat in Konya. And of course, this is where Rumi's from. This is, I think, the 4th year that we've run this. This is really the heart. We're going to visit our master to study the words, the life, the legacy of Rumi. It coincides with the Mystic Music Festival, where Sufi musicians from all over the world come, different seekers from all over the world. We sit with the great Mevlevis that are there, that are from the lineage of Rumi, and we get to visit Rumi's tomb every day, which is just one of the most potent places on earth. We read his poetry every day. We do dhikr. We're in community. And we're in the old city of Konya. We're doing art. We do the nays, music, and traditional arts with the great artisans. So if you haven't been, I think you'll love it. It's one of the highlights of my year, every year that I look forward to. You're all welcome. And we're just launching it this week. So this is the first announcement of it. And there's an early bird. Because it's the only retreat we're doing this year, it'll probably fill up. So if anyone's interested, I encourage you. Also, we have for our alumni, retreat alumni, we have a special discount. So that's all I wanted to mention. I hope you all join us and we can see you there in person in Konya. And then I wanted to give the floor to Dr. Abdullah to mention Dar Shifa. Now, Dar Shifa, I'll just say a few words because I'm very happy to see that Dar Shifa has been around, but Dr. Abdullah has really just relaunched his work, his offerings, the social media page, the website. I encourage everyone to follow them and to check in on what they're doing. And I'll let him say a bit more about what they have going on.
Jazakallah khair. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of things for a long time, and always like doing things with my wherever I was invited, and people are always saying, look, we need a place where we can find what you're doing. And so I finally got onto that track, and it's taken a while. But so we have Dar Shifa is both, there's several people that I've trained or work from the same model of healing, spiritual healing, focus on the heart. But unfortunately, we can't fill the demand. So it's very hard to find sessions. So we have clinicians there, but it's very hard. We don't have very much availability. So what we've done is provided courses that are pre-recorded. You can do your own pace that are on different topics, but we also have this guided meditations library for people. So we're focusing on what can people do from where they're at, giving them tools and to kind of empowering. But then we're also have a community there, so you can become a member, and we have monthly live webinars where I do Q&A, and some of the other clinicians also as well have a space where people can ask questions, even if you're not able to access the one-on-ones. It's a much more affordable, but also just accessible way to get support in a community. And then having all of these tools and stuff. And then we have a retreat coming up. So maybe if you go to the next slide, and I'll just briefly, so we have some webinars coming up. The QR code, I think, takes you to that page. It's there on the website though. And so there's one actually next Sunday with my colleague Suman, who's incredible. She's really powerful and works with community. Her focus is on like relational healing in community. So I really highly recommend checking that out next Sunday, and then later in the month with me. And then if you just go to the last slide, this is just our the website, and this QR code I think takes you to the Instagram. So we just launched an Instagram page like a month ago. So we're kind of babies in this world. So give us a follow if you're on that platform, and hopefully we'll catch up with this digital platforms, inshallah. Thanks everybody, and thank you Baraka Blue for inviting me, and Allah bless this course, and hopefully you all join it. It's a really good course, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, I just want to thank everyone for joining us, taking the time and honoring us with your presence. Of course, we would love to be physically present with everyone, but we take the means of technology, and we're just grateful that we can all be all around the world and yet together. The hearts are connected, and special thanks to our special guest, Dr. Abdallah. Always a blessing to see you and connect with you, and really, really excited for Dar Shifa, and encouraging everybody to check out what they're doing. And inshallah, we'll just close with a prayer. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Oh Allah, we thank you for the gift of being, the gift of health, the gift of safety, the gift of community, the gift of hidayah, of guidance, the gift of our elders and our teachers, the gift of our mothers and our fathers, the gift of our ancestors in this chain of transmission that has been preserved, and this beautiful way that has been preserved all the way back to our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're grateful for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi. We're grateful that he's alive in our hearts, and that every time that we pray, we're bringing life to his way, and every time we greet one another, we're giving life to his way. And every time we eat, and every time we sit and stand and lie, and every time we do the various adhkar, and every time we step in with our right foot, and every time we eat with our right hand, and every time we say Bismillah, we're giving life to his way. What a great blessing to be those who are honored in this way. Thank you, Allah. Oh Allah, make us people of gratitude. Make us those who are grateful for what we have before it is taken away. They say there are the most grateful for health are those that are sick, because now they realize the immeasurable gift of wellness. May we not be amongst those who have to be sick to be grateful for their well-being. May we not be those who have to be all alone to be grateful for the gift of community and of family and of friendship. May we be those that are grateful in our gifts and in our abundance, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. O Allah, we ask that you accept from us and our brothers and sisters on the path our intentions to draw near to you, and to purify our hearts, and to fulfill the purpose for which you sent us into existence. O Allah, we ask that you rectify the affairs of the Ummah and the hearts of the Ummah and the states of the Ummah, and that you bless the Ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi, and that you bring ease and goodness to those who are in suffering and in darkness and in hardship. and that you bring guidance and goodness to everyone who is in need, and we are all in need, and everyone who is in harm's way, and everyone who is looking for the path, and everyone who is seeking truth and seeking meaning and seeking community. O Allah, heal our sick and have mercy upon those who have passed away, and bless us and guide us. Ameen. Ameen. Ila hadrat Nabi al-Fatiha. Alhamdulillah. Thank you all for joining us. It's our intention to do this every month. And so we'll see you next month, and we'll see you in a few weeks in the course, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.